Hello, I'm Dr. Laura Cassidy, and I am with the Dyslexia Resource Center, and I'm delighted to be with y'all today. This is a really important podcast, and as the voices of dyslexia, we're going to talk about literacy screening, and it's basically how to tell that a student is struggling and has dyslexia, because we don't want to leave these students struggling. And what we want to do is increase identification, because that's so important to the student, because they're struggling in the classroom. Sometimes the parents know it, sometimes the teacher knows it, but often they don't know why. And so I'm really excited about this episode, and let's dive in. So we're going to talk about different screeners that the state of Louisiana uses, as well as what the Dyslexia Resource Center does as far as testing for dyslexia. Other states may be a little bit different, but it's going to be fairly similar. And my hope is that this will help you no matter where you live. If you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're a dyslexic student. So let's talk a little bit about the language model, because what the screeners are doing and what testing does is it's looking at certain skill sets. And I think it's so important for people to understand not just what the names of the screeners are or what the name of the testing is, but why is it important and what is it that they're looking at. And I will tell you that all this comes from Dr. Sally Shaywitz, Overcoming Dyslexia, the second edition. And what I want to talk about is the language model. And most of this is covered on page 40 to page 43. And I find this incredibly well written and important. So hopefully I can do it justice. So we're the lowest level of the language model. And when we say that, what we mean is we're taking language that is either the spoken word or the written word, and we're going deep in the brain, because we're basically trying to connect the spoken word with print. There's a chart, and it shows phonology, and that's PHONO-ology, or phonological processing. That's the bottom level, and phono means sound. And this is where the brain is going to process the distinctive spoken word, the sounds of spoken word. And then what the brain has to learn is how to match that to the alphabet, and then to words, and then to printed novels and bigger text. So we talk about how, again, the ear is a pass-through. It's an organ where the sound passes through, it registers the spoken word, and it goes deep in the brain. And what the brain has to do in the beginning, this is, what your children learn at 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age, is that words are an envelope of sound. But what they're going to figure out is that the words are broken up into smaller pieces. And that's called the phoneme. Again, that pho from phonology, the sound. And the example we use a lot is the cat, k-at. It's 3 sounds, 3 phonemes. And this is really important because, once you're a reader, you're like, did I really have to go through all of that to learn how to read? But indeed you did. And the beauty of it is, for 80% of the population, it's a pretty easy process. It's a learned process. But for the dyslexic, this is a process that has to be understood and then taught specifically. And is important for today. It's assessing, do they have this concept? So I want to go over the steps to master the alphabetic principle, because the alphabetic principle has to be mastered in order for the student to go on to learn to read. So the first would be, again, that the words that the child or the student hears are those envelopes of sound. And this child will start noticing that the word has different parts of sound. And one of the ways, of course, is rhyming. Because if you have cat, bat, mat, you're understanding that at, even though the beginning is different, is rhyming. And that's incredibly important. That is a skill that 3 and 4-year-olds develop. But a lot of dyslexic children do not hear that rhyming. So that's a clue. So that's that first step. It's a sound, an envelope of sound, but it has components. Then they have to recognize what those components are. So it's not that they just realize there are different sounds in the word, but they can identify what those sounds are. So the k, the eh, and the t. Then the child has to understand that it's those letters are representing a sound. So that C represents that k, and that A represents that ah, and that T represents that t. So you're taking it apart, you're putting a letter to the sound of it, and then you're putting it back together. And then that's the way that the child understands, the student understands that the spoken word and the written word are indeed related. They're all part and parcel. One is obviously you're hearing, the other one is that you're reading. And when this concept is developed, then the child can begin the process of learning to read. And it's important because if the child doesn't have those concepts, doesn't understand those principles, they're sitting in a class, but it makes no sense to them. And they won't be able to learn to read because, again, this is the access system, this phonology, this sound system is the way that you must enter the task of learning to read. So next I want to talk about the screeners that are being used in Louisiana in K through 3rd grade. And as I've said, if you don't live in Louisiana and you live in California, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Chicago, it's going to be similar. And the way that Louisiana does this is that they administer the screener in the classrooms 3 times a year. The first 30 days of the year, then they do it again in December, and then they do it again in April. So we're going to start with the kindergarten screener. And the kindergarten screener would include letter naming, and that would just be the alphabet. Can you name the alphabet? Then it would look at phonemic, there's that word again, that the sound, phonemic segmentation, which is what we just talked about. Do you understand that the word is broken apart into sounds, and can you break that apart? And I'm going to give you some examples of a test that actually really looks at this in detail. So hopefully this will make more sense. And then they have nonsense word fluency, and that means that's a way that we look to see if people really know what sound goes with a letter. So they have word naming fluency, which is taking words that we know, like shop or store or can or dog. And then they'll give them the nonsense word. So because you can memorize, kids can memorize, say frequent words. Okay. And what we're trying to find out is, do they really know what they're doing? Because if you're memorizing, when the words get harder, it's not going to work. And you haven't entered that phonological module. So a nonsense word may be like leck, words that aren't really words, but it forces the student to use that knowledge of what the sound is and matching it to the alphabet. So in both the kindergarten and the 1st grade, you're going to have letter naming, again, the alphabet. You're going to have that phonemic segmentation. You're going to have the nonsense word fluency. You're going to have the word meaning. But then what they're going to introduce in the 1st grade is oral reading. So they're going to read one passage for 60 seconds, and the computer's going to generate what percent of the words the student got correct and how many words they got correct in 60 seconds. So you can see In kindergarten, the skills that are necessary are knowing the alphabet, knowing that a word is an envelope of sound, but that you have to pull apart those sounds and then put it back together, that the link between the spoken word and the alphabet is understood. And then in the first grade, they're expecting the child to read. And so I say this because you need to know, parents, you need to know, how did my student do on these screeners? The teacher needs to understand, how are my students doing on these screeners? So the way they report it would be above benchmark, benchmark, or below benchmark. And certainly if your child is below benchmark, that is a red flag. And I strongly recommend that you have further testing, and we'll talk about that. It is possible to be above benchmark, less likely, but even at benchmark or above benchmark, your child could be dyslexic. But for time's sake, we're going to talk about those that have any red flags, and that would be below benchmark. And again, these are short tests. So I will say your child did okay on the test, but you listen to the child out loud, which is one of those important tests, and the child is reading like this. They have no emotion. And they have a lot of pauses, a lot of ands, that's a red flag. And it's so important that if you listen to your child read out loud and you notice any of that you go the next step. And again, the Dyslexia Resource Center has a lot of podcasts, a lot of information, ways to help you to find out if your child could possibly be or is dyslexic. So we talk about the kindergarten and the first grade. It's really important that we are picking up dyslexia in those two, the end of kindergarten or the beginning of first grade. And the reason is, as we've talked before on this podcast, is that gap is there. And it makes sense because a non-dyslexic has already mastered these skills. And so they're on to really learning how to read. And that's why the screeners are so important. But what's equally important is that you, the parent, or you, the teacher, know what it means. And it's not lip service. It's not, oh, we're going to do a little bit more of this or that. Really, it's so important. Why are they struggling? Because a lot of these kids are dyslexic. They need to be in the right classroom. They need to be with a trained teacher, the right curriculum, and they need to be on the road to acquiring those skills to read so they're not falling further and further behind. In second and third grade, there's also the screeners, and those are still looking at the nonsense word fluency. They've gone past the alphabet, of course. You would be surprised, though. There are children sitting in schools that don't know all the sounds to the alphabet in the second grade. But we're looking at nonsense word fluency, real word fluency, that oral reading, and then comprehension. And these are in both the second and the third grade. Now, if your child is struggling in comprehension, it is so important that you know, can they read? Because you cannot comprehend what you cannot read. So we're going to take comprehension, which is another skill set, and just say, we're trying to find out, can they read, and assume if they read, they're going to comprehend. This is more about the acquisition of reading skills. And it's important, again, in Louisiana, and I'm pretty sure Mississippi has this law, perhaps Alabama, but I suspect other states. If the child failed reading in third grade, they are to repeat the third grade, which is just a travesty. Because again, this should be identified in first grade. they should be in the right program, then you're not having this failure in third grade. But failing the third grade and then not identifying why they're failing isn't going to help them. You're just repeating what didn't work. So my sincere and strong recommendation for anybody that has a student that has failed the third grade in reading, that is below benchmark on any of the screeners in K through 3, that you, the parent, learn more about dyslexia, go to our website, the Dyslexia Resource Center, and really strongly consider testing, because the trajectory is huge for those that are identified and get what they need and those that don't. One is success because they're really smart kids, and one is not so successful because they feel so defeated because they're struggling in school all the time. So what we've talked about is why the screeners are important, what those K through 3 times a year screeners are, and the implications if you don't know. Now, I do want to talk about one other screener that is very important. It is done in Missouri, it's done in Louisiana, which is the Shaywitz Dyslexia Screener, and I've talked about it before. It's at the end of kindergarten. Now, I know that other states have dyslexia screeners, so this would apply to any of them, but in Louisiana, it's the Shaywitz Dyslexia Screener. It is done by every public school at the end of kindergarten. It is an incredibly valid test. It is asking the teacher to evaluate language skills. And I've heard all kinds of like, oh, it's the teacher and it's subjective. The teacher's been in the classroom with a student all year, and it is looking at skills like we talked about, that phonemic awareness to know that it's an envelope of sound, but it must be pulled apart and put together. It's looking at language skills that are appropriate for that grade. So if you got a letter, and I've seen the letters that say your child is at risk for dyslexia at the end of kindergarten, and the first one came out last year, so those students are at the end of first grade. The ones this year will be at the end of kindergarten. It is urgent. It is crucial that you have your test evaluated for dyslexia, because there is at least an 80% risk that your child has dyslexia. And if they're sitting in a traditional school, they are not going to get what they need. So this podcast is really a rally, a cry to urgency. If your child is at risk on that dyslexia screener at the end of kindergarten, even if it's the end of first grade, it's not too late. And again, we test at the Dyslexia Resource Center. The schools can test. There are other places to test, but you need to get your child assessed. And that's the call to action. So what we do at the Dyslexia Resource Center is we screen, and if you appear to be at risk or you have another entity that said you're at risk for dyslexia, then we do a battery of tests. And one of the tests we do is the CTOP. And this is a CTOP 2 for ages 7 to 24. Standardized testing. And the CTOP stands for Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, second edition. And we talked about that phonological, that sound, the sounds of the spoken word, and relating it to the written word. And the reason I want to go over it is because the screeners that we talked about in K through 3 are very brief assessments. It is possible your child could do okay on that and still have dyslexia. So I'm hoping that this might help you, give you a little bit more information as a parent or as a teacher of what we're looking for as clues and why we do the CTOP. So we do 3 subtests. The first one is the elision. And basically what this doing is omitting a sound or a syllable. And if the child misses 3 in a row, then the examiner stops the test. And so I'm going to give you some examples, and hopefully this will help you just like, oh, this is what the brain has to do. And again, if you're not dyslexic and you're an adult, it seems so easy to you. So the first would be to say a word like cowgirl. And so you say cowgirl. And then you say cowgirl without using girl. And so they would use cow. Most of the kids can get it, but there's some, and this is going to get progressively harder. Or you say airplane. They say airplane without the plane, and it's air. Or spider without the der, and that would be spy. Then we go to taking away smaller parts of the word. So we'd say cup without the k. So that would be up. Or we say mat without the m, and that would be at. And this is where, with really young kids, you're going to start seeing a problem. And then it progresses. So then you're going to see faster without saying the s. So now it's in the middle. So it's fatter. Or tiger without the g, and that's tire. Or split without the p, and that would be slit. So it gets more complicated and nuanced. And obviously we're looking for, as a child ages, more of that discernment of language. And what I'm encouraging to do is pick this up as early as possible. So the elision's the first test. The second one we look at is the blending words. And again, I'm just giving you an abbreviation of these tests. So we might say, what word do these sounds make? So this is the introduction. We say skate, board. And they're easy, right? They say skateboard. Candy. But then we go and we'll say, okay, you're going to hear different parts of a word, and we want you to blend it, put it all together. So it might sound something like number, number, or answer. And again, it's going to get harder. And then we'll go to mad, or nap. And you think this is easy. Wait till I get to the harder ones. It's harder for me. How about stamp? And this is really remarkable to me. Again, this is what the brain does. This is what we teach, and it evolves over time. And for us adults that aren't dyslexic, it seems like, wow, I didn't know my brain did all of this. And then some of the harder ones would be mathematics. Hard, right? Mathematics. So that's the elision, and that's the blended. And then we do phoneme isolation. And you can see this is a really thorough way to see if those students have that necessary skills to enter the language model. We're going to go to a word game where we ask them to say parts of the word. So we would say, what is the first sound in the word fan? And of course, the answer is f. Or we'd say, what's the last sound in the word mop, which is p. It gets a little harder. Train has 4 sounds, t, r, a, n. And we'll ask them, what is the second sound, which would be t, r, rain. But then we'll not give feedback anymore. We'll say, okay, what is the second sound in the word flat? Flat. And it's l. So it gets a little harder. What is the second sound in the word island? island. Well, it's the L again. That S is silent. Or what is the third sound? What is the third sound in the word split? Split. So you've got the SP, but you actually hear the sp. You hear the S and the P, so it's the L. So again, this is called the C-top. There's another one for kids that are 6, but the majority of the kids, obviously 7 and above, we use this. And it's just an excellent way to assess those phonological processing skills which are needed for the child to enter the model, the language model. So today, in summary, what we've covered is the reading is an acquisition of skills. It's an understanding that you've got a big word, but it's composed of parts of sound, which are the phonemes, that one has to understand that they come apart, that they're related to the written word, and then they're put back together. And again, you see that with rhyming in the early years. Part of it is learning the alphabet. Part of that is in learning simple words, which would be like consonant, vowel, consonant, one syllable, like dog, cat, bat, now. And then once you've mastered that alphabetic principle, then you're able to embark on the first grade into reading. And if we look, the acquisition of reading skills is huge in the first and second grade. So if your dyslexic child has done poorly on a benchmark, any benchmarks in K through 3, I just strongly recommend that you have your child further evaluate. And if your child is told to repeat third grade or any grade because of reading, I would have the child tested for dyslexia. And if it's not dyslexia, which the majority of them are, you want to know, right? Just like if you had cancer, you want to know what kind of cancer it is. That seems pretty drastic. But the point being, information and knowledge is is powerful. It's what's going to help you, whether you're a parent or a teacher, what the child needs. And if we don't have that, we're just guessing. So I hope this helped you. There are plenty of resources on our website at the Dyslexia Resource Center. Please share this podcast with other teachers, other parents. Reach out to us if you have questions. And remember, early diagnosis is best for your child, but a diagnosis at any time is going to be a way to get your child to the best possible place so that they could succeed in life. So thank you so much for joining this podcast, and catch you on the next one.